In an Arizona POW camp, Hauptmann Klaus Richter expected cruelty, starvation, and humiliation, but the Americans deployed a far more devastating weapon against him, a stack of glossy magazines. Retry the Arizona sun was a hammer, and the land was its anvil. Hauptmann Klaus Richter felt his starched collar, now limp with sweat and stained with the fine red dust of the desert, clinging to his skin like a shroud. As the truck rumbled through the gates of the Papago Park POW camp, he held his spine rigid, a final act of defiance against the inevitable. He was an officer of the German Reich, a mind sharpened in the crucible of the propaganda ministerium captured in the final chaotic collapse of Tunis. He knew what came next. Defeat had a universal language, and its grammar was humiliation. He expected the snarling dogs, the spit, the blows from rifle butts. He anticipated the jeering faces of his captors, their eyes filled with the righteous hatred of the victor. He had studied their propaganda, crude, sentimental, portraying the German soldier as a barbaric monster. Now he would be treated as the beast he was said to be. He steeled himself for meager rations of stale bread and thin soup, for cold nights shivering on a concrete floor, for the slow, grinding erosion of his dignity. This was the nature of total war, the righteous crucible his own nation had embraced. Hardship forged will, suffering purified the soul. The Americans, soft and decadent, would likely be clumsy in their cruelty, but cruel they would be. It was the only logical outcome. The cruelty never came. The blows were the relentless sunshine and the crushing boredom. The guards were not jack-booted demons, but lanky boys with lazy drawls who chewed gum and seemed more interested in baseball scores than in tormenting their charges. The food was bland, tasteless, but astonishingly plentiful. Stews with thick chunks of unidentifiable meat, white bread of a baffling softness, coffee that was weak but hot and served with real sugar. It was a disorienting mercy, a psychological attack of a kind Klaus had not been trained to counter. Contempt was a shield. Kindness, however indifferent, left him exposed. Weeks bled into months. The routine of the camp, the morning roll call, the work details, the long, shimmering afternoons, became its own form of prison. Klaus, whose life had been a whirlwind of directives, broadcasts, and the relentless crafting of a nation's narrative, found himself adrift in a sea of empty time. To preserve his mind, he sought out the camp's library, a small wooden hut that smelled of dry rot and hot paper. He went not for comfort, but for intelligence. He wanted to dissect the enemy's mind, to see the lies they told themselves, to find the cracks in their ideological armor. The shelves were sparsely populated with dog-eared novels and religious tracts, but one section held a treasure trove, stacks of recent American magazines, Life, the Saturday Evening Post. Look, here it was, the beating heart of the American propaganda machine. He pulled a copy of Life from the top of a pile, the glossy cover cool against his fingertips. He sat at a rough-hewn table, the glare from the window forcing him to squint. He bypassed the articles about the war, the photographs of smiling GIs handing out chocolate bars, the heroic tales from the Pacific, the maps with bold arrows thrusting into enemy territory. It was all predictable, clumsy fiction. He had produced far more sophisticated material himself. It was a game of mirrors, and he had no interest in admiring his enemy's distorted reflections. He turned a page, and his clinical analysis came to a sudden, jarring halt. It was not a story of the war. It was an advertisement, a full 2-page spread, rendered in colors so vibrant it seemed to hum with life. A woman impossibly beautiful with hair like spun gold and teeth like polished ivory was laughing. Her lips, painted a defiant, glistening scarlet, were parted in a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. The advertisement was for lipstick. Not just lipstick, but a specific brand, Tangee's Petal Finish Lipstick. Below her radiant face were smaller images displaying a dozen different shades with names like medium red, theatrical red, and gay red. A dozen shades of red for a woman's lips in the middle of a world war. Klaus stared. He felt a strange, cold sensation creep up his spine. In Berlin, women scraped soap scraps together. They wore their hair in sensible buns, and their faces were pale with fatigue and determination. Beauty was a sacrifice laid upon the altar of the fatherland. Here, beauty was a product, a commodity. something to be chosen from a catalog of trivial variations. This wasn't propaganda designed to boost morale for the war effort. It was designed to sell something utterly decadently useless. He turned the page, his movements stiff. Another ad. A family. A father in a smart suit. A mother in a pearl necklace. Two beaming children standing beside a gleaming blue automobile. A 1942 Ford Super Deluxe. The headline read, "Something to look forward to." The text spoke of post-war drives, of picnics in the countryside, of the freedom of the open road. Klaus's own family car, a sturdy Opel, had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht 3 years ago. The thought of a private citizen owning a car for leisure, let alone dreaming of a new one, was a fantasy from another universe. The steel in that Ford, the rubber in its tires, the gasoline it would consume, it was a direct theft from the war effort. And yet, here it was, presented not as treason, but as a promise. He began to leaf through the magazines with a feverish intensity. It was an assault. Page after page, the cultural shock intensified, building like a physical pressure behind his eyes. An advertisement for a Kelvinator refrigerator, its door swung open to reveal a landscape of impossible plenty. Bottles of milk, a pyramid of oranges, sticks of butter in waxy paper, a glistening ham, and strange, wobbling towers of colored gelatin called Jell-O. Klaus thought of the Eintopfsonntag, the one-pot Sunday meal designed to save resources for the state, of the ration cards his wife wrote of in her carefully censored letters, of the gnawing patriotic hunger that was the constant companion of every German citizen. This picture was not a depiction of a feast for a national holiday. It was presented as the everyday, normal contents of a single family's appliance. This was the core of his conflict. His first instinct, the reflex of the propagandist, was to label it a lie. This must be a carefully constructed fantasy world, a form of psychological warfare more insidious than any he had conceived. They were showing the prisoners a paradise to break their spirit, to make them yearn for the enemy's way of life. It was a clever, if decadent, trick. He clung to this explanation. It was the only barrier he had against a rising tide of cognitive dissonance. These images could not be real. They defied the fundamental laws of a world at war. A nation could not produce this frivolity, while also producing tanks, planes, and ships on a scale to challenge the Reich. It was a logical impossibility. One did not build a war machine and a consumer paradise simultaneously. One chose. Germany had chosen glory and sacrifice. America, it seemed, was pretending it could have both. It had to be a lie. The proof that it was not a lie came a week later, on a blisteringly hot afternoon. Klaus was part of a work detail, replacing a stretch of barbed wire fence under the indifferent watch of 2 guards. One of them, a young corporal named Miller with a perpetually bored expression, was leaning against a jeep, reading a letter from home. His friend, another guard, ambled over. "Good news, Miller?" the friend asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Miller snorted, folding the letter with a frustrated sigh. "Depends what you call good news. My brother-in-law, Dave, finally got his promotion down at the Ford plant in Detroit, making good money. So what's the problem?" "The problem," Miller said, kicking at a loose stone, "is my sister, Peggy. She's driving him crazy. Before he left for the Army, Dave put a deposit down on a new Chevy Fleetline. Now she writes that the dealer called, said they might not get any new models until 46, and he's offering them their deposit back, or a 42 model he's got on the lot. So? Take the 42, the friend shrugged. A car's a car. That's what I told her, Miller exclaimed, his voice rising in exasperation. But Peggy wants the 46. She saw an ad for it, says it's got new streamlined styling. She'd rather have no car for 2 years than drive an old one. Can you believe that? There's a war on, and she's worried about streamlined styling. Klaus froze. His hands, gripping the wire cutters, went numb. He was 10 feet away, a ghost in a prisoner's uniform, but the words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't meant to hear this conversation. It was a mundane complaint, a private moment of familial frustration between 2 bored American boys. And, in its absolute unthinking mundanity, it was the most profound revelation of his life. The car from the advertisement, it was real. The family that wanted it, they were real. The industrial plant that would build it, it was real. The entire world depicted on those glossy pages was not a propagandist's fantasy. It was a temporarily postponed reality that these soldiers took so for granted they could complain about its minor inconveniences. They weren't fighting to create this world. They were fighting to get back to it. This casual conversation, overheard by chance in the middle of the Arizona desert, was the irrefutable, soul-crushing evidence. America wasn't pretending it could have both guns and butter. It simply could. That evening, Klaus returned to the library. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the barracks. He sat at the same table, the stack of magazines before him. But he was no longer looking at them through the eyes of a propagandist. He was looking at them through the eyes of an archaeologist, unearthing the artifacts of a civilization far more powerful and alien than he could have ever imagined. He slowly turned the pages. The laughing woman with the gay red lips, the smiling family beside their blue sedan, the refrigerator groaning with food. These were no longer images of decadent weakness. They were terrifying testaments of strength. Every tube of lipstick was a display of chemical industry capacity not being used for explosives. Every new car was a symbol of steel production, factory automation, and engineering skill that existed in surplus to the war effort. That refrigerator was the true symbol of American power. It was not just the food it held, but the entire industrial chain it represented. The vast farms, the efficient transportation networks, the power grid that spanned a continent, the manufacturing base that could stamp out millions of these complex machines for no other reason than private comfort. The German Weltanschauung was built on the nobility of sacrifice. The state demanded everything, and the people gave it, believing that this collective focused will was the ultimate source of strength. They had channeled every ounce of their industrial might, every calorie of their people's energy, into the creation of the most fearsome war machine the world had ever seen. They had created the Tiger tank, the Stuka dive bomber, the V-2 rocket, and the Americans had created the Kelvinator refrigerator. Klaus felt a cold, hollow dread spread through his chest. He finally understood. His leaders had seen American consumerism and called it decadence. They had seen its individualism and called it weakness. They had fundamentally, catastrophically misunderstood the nature of their enemy. They had not been fighting a nation of soft, undisciplined merchants. They had been fighting an industrial colossus so vast, so endlessly productive, that it could fight the greatest war in human history with one hand while using the other to stock its refrigerators and dream of new cars. The war was already over. It had been over before he was even captured. The victor was not decided on the battlefields of Kursk or Normandy, but in the gleaming, full-color advertisements of the Saturday Evening Post. Germany's total war was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. America's total war was a temporary inconvenience that might delay the delivery of a new Chevrolet. He closed the magazine, the slick paper making a soft final sound in the quiet room. His certainty, his ideological armor, had not been pierced by a bullet or a bayonet. It had been annihilated by a 2-page advertisement for lipstick. He was a prisoner not merely of the American army, but of a truth so overwhelming it left no room for his old world. They hadn't been fighting a war of soldiers. They had been fighting a war of factories. And he had just seen, in the mundane promise of a better refrigerator, the unconditional surrender of his entire universe.